All right, so welcome back. We've spent the last two really getting into like the nitty-gritty of the Gambia's 2025 national budget.
Absolutely.
And we've, crunched the numbers. We looked at the programs, like the whole nine yards.
Yep.
But today we're kind of shifting gears a little bit. Instead of asking what's in the budget, we're asking what's not in the budget.
That's right.
What are the gaps?
What are they not telling us?
Yeah, what's been left unsaid and what might those omissions tell us about the bigger picture?
Yeah, it's like we've read the book and now we're looking for like the missing chapter.
Exactly. And trust me, there's more to this story
There is a lot more to this story.
than meets the eye. Okay, so let's set the stage here.
Yeah.
From what we've seen so far, in the budget itself, it paints a pretty optimistic picture of the Gambia's, economic future, right?
I mean, on the surface, absolutely.
Yeah.
We're looking at projected GDP growth of, 5.8% inflation is supposed to drop towards, the 5% target, and they're projecting a more stable exchange rate.
So, sounds like smooth sailing,
Mm-hmm.
but, I have a feeling you're about to tell me there's a little bit more to it than that.
Well, I mean,
What are they glossing over?
well, those rosy projections, they kind of hinge on some pretty big assumptions.
Okay.
Like moderating commodity prices,
Yeah.
And successful implementation of all these like ambitious reforms that they've outlined.
Right.
But the budget, it barely acknowledges the potential downsides.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, for one, like global economic growth is projected to be pretty sluggish, and that
Yeah.
could impact demand for Gambian exports
Yeah.
and really throw a wrench in their plans. Then there's always, the volatility of commodity prices.
Right.
A sudden spike in global prices could send inflation soaring.
Yeah.
And, and let's not forget about the Gambia's, unreliable electricity supply.
Right.
That's a major obstacle for businesses.
So it sounds like they're banking on a best case scenario, but haven't really factored in, the potential for things to go south.
Yeah, precisely.
Okay.
And that's just, the backdrop. I
Right.
mean, when we start digging into, specific sectors, the omissions get even more interesting.
Okay. Where do we start?
Well, one of the, major focuses of the budget is boosting government revenue,
Okay.
which makes sense.
Right.
I mean, you need money to make things happen.
Of course.
But, when we look at the details, the lack of concrete strategies
Yeah.
for certain key sectors is a little baffling.
Okay. So let's take a look at this estimates of revenue and expenditure document that you were talking about.
Sure.
Okay. So I see here they're projecting an increase in revenue from things like fishing licenses, hunting permits, even mining royalties.
Yeah.
All good signs, right?
I mean, on the surface, yes.
Yeah.
But then you see the stark contrast, absolutely zero projected revenue
Wow.
from demarcation of community forest.
So they're expecting to get all this money from, these licenses and permits from fishing and mining,
Yeah.
but nothing from, managing and protecting these forests.
Yeah, that's a red flag.
That seems like a missed opportunity, at the very least.
At the very least.
So what's the potential cost of this oversight? I mean, are we talking about a few $1,000s here, or is it something more significant?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Experts estimate that the Gambia could be losing out on millions of dollars annually
Wow.
by not effectively managing its community forests.
Wait.
We're talking about potential revenue from sustainable timber harvesting,
Wait.
ecotourism,
Right.
even carbon credits.
Millions of dollars.
Yeah.
That's not chump change.
No.
And it makes you wonder why they're turning a blind eye to this potential income stream.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
And it makes you question whether, they're truly committed to these lofty, sustainable development goals they keep talking about.
Okay, so we've got a potential multi-million-dollar gap in revenue from forestry.
Mm-hmm.
What other surprises are lurking in this budget?
Well, let's move on to the workforce budget section of the program-based budgeting book.
Okay.
And this is where things get really strange.
All right, hit me with it. What's so strange about the workforce budget?
Well, we start to see some pretty significant inconsistencies in how they're allocating funds for salaries and allowances
Okay.
across, different ministries.
Okay, let's break it down. What's catching your eye?
Well, take a look at the Ministry of Agriculture.
Okay.
They have a substantial increase for like managing existing programs and institutions,
Go on.
but absolutely zero allocated for research and development.
Hold on. $0 for agricultural R&D.
Yeah.
In a country where agriculture is such a crucial part of the economy,
It's a choice.
It's bold.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like saying, hey, whatever we're doing now is good enough.
It suggests they might be content with relying on existing technologies rather than investing in new research and innovation.
But is it really?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And, it kind of leads us to another, fascinating and, frankly, concerning aspect of this budget.
Okay.
The paradox of program-based budgeting.
PBB.
Yes, PBB.
Okay. Remind me what that's all about.
Sure. Program-based budgeting, or PBB, is all about linking spending to concrete national goals,
right,
and measurable outcomes.
Yeah.
Instead of just throwing money at line items, you're supposed to focus on what those funds are actually achieving. Accountability, transparency, that sort of thing.
Right. Sounds like a good idea in theory.
In theory.
So what's the paradox?
Well, the government keeps saying they're committed to this whole PBB approach. But when you actually look at the budget documents,
it's all smoke and mirrors.
Pretty much.
Okay.
They're missing detailed performance indicators and target values for, a ton of programs across, multiple ministries.
So how are they supposed to measure success if they haven't even defined what success looks like?
Exactly.
And how can we hold them accountable if we don't know what they're aiming for?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that lack of clarity is what makes this whole PBD thing feel more like a PR move than, a genuine commitment to transparency and good governance.
So we've got a potential revenue gap in forestry. We've got a questionable approach to agricultural development.
Yeah.
And we've got this PBB paradox that raises more questions than answers.
Definitely.
I'm sensing a theme here.
You're catching on.
Yeah.
And believe me, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We'll get a lot more to unpack when we come back for part 2.
All right, well, we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back. All right, so we're back. And I have to say, this budget is getting more and more intriguing by the minute. We've already uncovered some pretty significant omissions, like a potential, revenue gap in forestry, that head-scratching approach to agricultural development,
right,
and this whole program-based budgeting paradox that just screams like lack of transparency.
Yeah, and remember, we're just scratching the surface.
Right.
These omissions, they have real-world consequences.
Yeah, let's talk about those consequences. Let's start with forestry.
Okay.
You mentioned that the Gambia could be missing out on millions in revenue by not properly managing their community forests.
Right.
What does that actually look like on the ground?
Well, for starters, it means those communities who rely on the forests for their livelihoods are missing out on potential income.
Right.
Sustainable timber harvesting, for example, could create jobs and boost local economies.
All right.
But without proper management plans in place, the risk of illegal logging increases, which can lead to deforestation, habitat loss, and ultimately less revenue in the long run.
So it's not just about the money.
Right.
It's about the long-term sustainability of the entire ecosystem.
Exactly.
And neglecting these forests also means missing out on opportunities for ecotourism.
Right.
Which could bring in valuable foreign currency.
Absolutely.
There's even potential for carbon credits, which are becoming increasingly important in the fight against climate change.
Indeed.
Okay, so there's a clear economic and environmental cost to ignoring this sector.
Yeah.
What about agriculture? We talked about that lack of funding for research and development. What are the implications of that decision?
It's a gamble, that's for sure.
Okay.
Relying solely on existing technologies might work in the short term. But it risks leaving the Gambia's agricultural sector vulnerable to new challenges. Climate change, for example, is already impacting crop yields and water resources.
Right.
And without investment in R&D, they're going to be stuck playing catch-up.
So instead of being proactive in developing solutions tailored to their specific needs, they're potentially setting themselves up for a crisis down the line.
Exactly. And it also sends a message to young scientists and innovators that their skills and ideas aren't valued.
Right.
And that could lead to a brain drain with talented Gambians leaving to pursue opportunities elsewhere.
It's a missed opportunity on so many levels.
It really is.
So we've got potential economic and environmental consequences in forestry, a lack of long-term vision in agriculture, and then there's this whole PBB mystery.
Yeah.
I feel like a pattern is emerging here.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, and this pattern kind of points towards a lack of transparency and accountability.
Yeah.
The government's making these big promises about economic growth and sustainable development, but the details are fuzzy.
Right.
The targets are vague, And the mechanisms for holding them accountable are missing.
That's right. And that's where it gets really interesting.
Exactly.
We're not just highlighting problems.
Yeah.
We're giving our listeners the tools to understand those problems
Right.
and ask the right questions.
And speaking of impact, there's one glaring omission we haven't talked about yet.
Okay.
Social issues, specifically youth unemployment,
Right.
poverty reduction, and food security.
Yeah. Those are all mentioned in the budget.
Yeah,
but it's all very surface level. Lots of broad statements about improving livelihoods, empowering communities.
Right.
But very little in terms of concrete action plans or dedicated funding.
It's like they're acknowledging the problems,
Right.
but not offering any real solutions.
Exactly.
And it raises the question, are they truly committed to addressing these challenges?
Yeah.
Or are they just paying lip service to them?
That's a good question.
Let's play devil's advocate for a second.
Okay.
Is there any chance that these omissions are due to factors beyond the government's control?
I mean,
Maybe they simply don't have the resources to tackle everything at once.
that's a fair point. Resources are always limited.
Right.
Governments have to make tough choices.
Right.
But that's where prioritization comes in.
Uh-huh.
And based on this budget, it doesn't seem like addressing the root causes of youth unemployment or tackling food insecurity are very high on their list of priorities.
So it's not just a matter of lacking resources.
Right.
It's about how they're choosing to allocate the resources that they do have.
Exactly. And that's where transparency and accountability become even more important.
Yeah.
Citizens need to be able to see how their money is being spent
Right.
and hold their leaders accountable for those decisions.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential consequences of these omissions.
Huh?
We've considered some alternative explanations. Yeah. But at the end of the day, what's the message for our listeners?
Well, we want them to be informed, engaged, and empowered.
Okay.
We want them to understand that a budget isn't just a bunch of numbers.
Right.
It's a reflection of a government's priorities and values.
And we want them to know they have a voice in this process.
Absolutely. The budget documents are publicly available.
Right.
We encourage everyone to take a look.
Yeah.
Analyze the numbers and ask those tough questions. Contact your elected officials.
Right.
Share your concerns and demand better.
Because this is your money.
Exactly.
Your future.
Right.
Your country.
Right.
And you deserve government that is transparent, accountable, and truly committed to the well-being of all Gambians. Covered a lot of ground.
We have.
Everything from those missing millions in forestry revenue to that kind of questionable approach to agricultural development.
Right.
And of course, who can forget that program-based budgeting paradox?
Some PBB paradox.
Yeah. Talk about a head-scratcher. But, we've also discussed the potential consequences
Yes.
of these, omissions.
Absolutely.
And it's clear that they could have a significant impact on the lives of everyday Gambians.
Definitely.
But, rather than just leaving our listeners with a sense of doom and gloom,
Right.
I think it's important to kind of shift gears a little bit. We've got this rise in crimes that are really just driven by survival.
Yeah, people are just trying to get by.
So all of these factors are really important, I think, as we examine the Gambia's budget.
Absolutely. They provide a crucial lens for interpretation.
Yeah, for sure.
One figure immediately grabbed my attention, and that was the 28.63% increase year-on-year for compensation of employees.
Oh, wow. That's substantial.
Yeah, it's significant, and most of that is concentrated within wages and salaries. Now, on the surface, that might sound like a good thing, right?
Yeah, more money in people's pockets.
Right, stimulating the economy. But it's important to look at it in context. When you compare that increase with the relatively small allocations for support to victims and support to differently abled people, it raises some questions.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about priorities.
Absolutely. Are these groups who are often the most vulnerable, are they being adequately supported?
Especially during these economically unstable times.
Exactly. Tough times call for even stronger support systems.
For sure. So it seems like we're already seeing a bit of a theme here. This idea of maybe focusing on surface-level solutions without necessarily addressing the deeper, more complex issues.
Right. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. It might look okay for a minute, but it doesn't really fix the problem.
Exactly. And we see this pattern continue as we look at other areas like infrastructure. There's a lot of investment in roads and bridges, which, again, on the surface sounds great.
Oh, yeah. Infrastructure is essential for development.
Absolutely. But when you look at the funding for colleges and other tertiary institutions in 2027.
What do we see? It's zero.
Zero funding. That's a huge red flag for me.
Yeah, it's a drastic cut and begs the question, is the Gambia prioritizing short-term needs over long-term investments? Building roads is important, but what about investing in education and the nation's future?
Right, because what good is a route if you have nowhere to go?
That's a good point. It's about having a vision for the future.
And speaking of things that seem to disappear, take a look at the Constituency Development Fund. It's fully funded in 2023 and 2024 at D29,005, but then, poof, nothing.
Gone.
In 2025, 2026, and 2027. Why this sudden shift?
Yeah, it's quite a mystery.
Is it a resource issue? A strategic change? I mean, what's the story there?
The budget estimates don't really give us a clear answer, but maybe the PBB document can shed some light on the rationale behind these allocations.
Right. The PBB is all about connecting those dots between the money and the intended outcomes. It's like how the budget's what. But before we dive into that, there's one more line item that caught my eye, and that's reparations.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one, going from 0 in 2023 to a pretty substantial D70 mills in 2026, and then D75 mills in 2027.
That's a massive jump. It suggests a real shift in priorities, a recognition of past injustices that need to be addressed. But what exactly does this allocation entail? Who will benefit from this? How will it actually impact the lives of Gambians?
All very important questions. And that's where the PBB becomes really crucial and helps us understand not just how much money is being allocated, but also how they plan to use it. And what specific outcomes are they hoping to achieve?
So the PBB is like our magnifying glass. It helps us zoom in and see the finer points of this picture. So I think it's time to grab that magnifying glass and dive into the PBB.
Let's do it.
And let's start with a few key ministries that I think touch the lives of pretty much every Gambian. We're talking agriculture, education, health and gender, children, and social welfare.
Sounds like a good plan. Let's see what these ministries have in store for navigating these turbulent times.
And what their priorities reveal about the Gambia's vision for the future.
Absolutely. Lots to unpack there. Let's kick things off with the Ministry of Agriculture.
Okay, agriculture.
So their vision is pretty straightforward. They want to achieve food security for the Gambia. And I mean, especially with all the turmoil in global food markets, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, with food prices skyrocketing everywhere.
Right, exactly.
Makes sense to focus on shoring up local food production.
Yeah, definitely. So one of their key budget programs focuses on, you guessed it, crop production and productivity.
Makes sense.
Boost yields, reduce reliance on imports, make the food system more resilient.
That sounds great in theory, but remember we were talking earlier about looking beyond the surface.
Oh, right. Digging a little deeper.
What are the specifics?
Exactly.
Are they investing in climate-resilient crops?
Good question.
Things that can withstand drought or floods? Or are they providing training to farmers?
Are they giving them resources?
Because you can't just throw money at crop production and expect it to magically solve the problem.
Yeah, throwing money at a problem rarely solves it. You need a well-thought-out strategy.
Absolutely. So what are we seeing in terms of strategy?
So this is where those performance indicators come in. The ministry has outlined some specific targets, like increasing the production of certain staple crops. But are those targets realistic? And are they measuring the right things?
It's like saying we're going to increase the number of fish caught, but not saying what kind of fish, where they're fishing, or if it's even sustainable.
Exactly. You could end up with a lot of the wrong fish and an ecosystem in trouble.
Yeah, you got to be specific.
You need those details. And this brings us back to that idea of citizen engagement. Gambians really need to be asking these questions.
Right, holding their leaders accountable.
Are these indicators actually measuring progress towards a more resilient food system, or are they just ticking boxes?
Right, it's easy to manipulate data to make things look good on paper.
But are they really translating to real-world impact?
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked a bit about food security.
Food security is crucial.
Let's shift gears now and talk about healthcare. The Ministry of Health, their goal is to provide accessible healthcare for all Gambians, which is a fantastic goal, of course. But we know that things can get a bit complicated.
Right. It's a noble goal, but the reality on the ground can be much more complex.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what are some of the challenges they're facing?
Well, one major challenge is a chronic shortage of essential medicines. I mean, it's a persistent problem.
Yeah, that's a big one.
So naturally, their PBB includes a budget program for disease control to try to address this, improve access to medicines, reduce stockouts, all that good stuff.
Okay, that's the start. But again, the devil is in the details. How are they planning to tackle this issue? Are they investing in local pharmaceutical production to maybe reduce reliance on imports? Are they streamlining the procurement process so things move more quickly and efficiently?
Yeah, are they addressing those bottlenecks?
Because again, you can't just allocate money to disease control and expect the problem to magically disappear.
Exactly. And yet again, those performance indicators are really key here. The ministry is tracking things like the percentage of health facilities with adequate stock. But are those numbers telling the whole story?
Right. Are we getting the full picture?
What types of medicines are running out? How often are they running out? What is the impact on patients?
Right. Because a 90% stock rate might sound impressive at first glance.
That sounds pretty good.
But if the 10% that's missing includes life-saving medications, well, that's a huge problem.
Absolutely. It's like having a toolbox with all the tools except the one you really need.
Right. The one that holds everything together.
That wrench that's essential.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this brings us to that concept we were talking about earlier, surrealism versus automaton. Gambians need to question these statistics.
Yeah, don't just accept them at face value.
They need to dig deeper and demand more transparency, more accountability.
Absolutely. Connect those numbers to real-life experiences.
Right. Ask,
Yeah.
are these policies actually improving access to quality healthcare?
Yeah, are they making a difference?
And this leads us, I think, quite nicely to the Ministry of Gender, Children, and Social Welfare. I mean, they have a huge GE mandate.
They have a lot on their plate.
Everything from gender equality to rights of children and people with disabilities. Really challenging portfolio.
Yeah, especially in the current economic and security climate. Where do you even begin?
Right, it's a lot. So what are some of their key priorities?
Well, one of the big ones is reducing violence against children, which unfortunately is a pressing issue in the Gambia.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. And their strategy focuses on strengthening case management, building capacity within child protection services, and also raising awareness in the communities.
Okay, a multi-pronged approach. But again, we have to look at the specifics. What does violence against children actually encompass in this context?
Right. What are we actually talking about?
Are they looking at all forms of violence? Physical, emotional, sexual?
Are they taking a holistic approach?
Are they addressing the reported cases as well as the hidden violence that often goes unreported?
Did we know that's a significant issue?
Right, the tip of the iceberg. So how do the performance indicators reflect this?
Yeah. Are they capturing the complexity of the problem?
Because simply tracking the number of reported cases might not give us the full picture.
It might not even scratch the surface.
Right, we need to look at access to support services, changes in attitudes and behaviors.
And ultimately, a reduction in the overall prevalence of violence.
Exactly, because we don't just want to be reacting to violence, we want to prevent it.
Absolutely. We want to create a safer environment for children.
So it's about measuring outcomes, not just outputs.
Right. What's the actual impact on the ground?
Are these programs actually making a difference in the lives of children? Are they creating a safer environment, a more protective environment?
And this is where that citizen engagement piece is just so vital.
It's crucial.
Gambians need to be involved in monitoring these programs. They need to be providing feedback.
They need to be holding the government accountable for achieving real lasting change.
Exactly. It's about working together.
Because at the end of the day, it's about ensuring that these budget allocations are actually translating into tangible improvements.
Right. That they're having a positive impact.
For the most vulnerable members of society. It's about creating a future where all Gambians, regardless of their age, their gender, their ability, can thrive.
That's a vision worth striving for.
Absolutely. And speaking of striving, we've talked about food security, we've talked about healthcare, we've talked about social welfare, all critically important issues. But let's not forget about education, especially with that zero funding for tertiary institutions in 2027 looming large. So let's delve into the Ministry of Education's PBB and see how they're planning to navigate this incredibly tricky landscape.
So the Ministry of Education, their vision is to create a knowledge-based society.
Ambitious.
Very ambitious. But how do you actually achieve that with this big funding gap for tertiary institutions? Their PBB does outline some interesting strategies, though.
Okay, let's hear it.
They're focusing on things like improving early childhood education, boosting teacher training, and expanding access to technology in schools.
Makes sense. Invest in the foundation, build a strong teaching force, prepare students for a digital world.
Right.
But how does this connect to the zero funding for colleges? It feels like a disconnect.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? It's like building this beautiful staircase, but forgetting to add the top step.
Right, where do you go from there?
Exactly. So we need to really look closely at what the ministry is saying about this funding gap.
Are they just hoping for the best?
Are they expecting maybe increased private investment in higher education? Or are they banking on scholarships or external funding? Or is this a case of wishful thinking?
It's like they're saying, we'll figure it out later, but later is coming up fast.
Yeah, time's ticking.
And students need to know what their options are.
They need some clarity.
This is another moment where Gambians really need to be asking those tough questions and holding their leaders accountable for a clear path forward.
Absolutely, they deserve answers.
So we've explored these key ministries, but we can't really talk about a nation's finances without talking about fiscal policy.
Right, the big picture stuff.
Right, we talked about those levers earlier: revenue mobilization, spending prioritization, debt management. All of that's laid out in the PBB.
It's all there.
So what are some of the key things that stood out to you?
Well, there are a few interesting measures that they're proposing.
Like what?
For example, they're planning to increase the personal income tax threshold from D24,000 to D36,000 per annum.
Okay, so that means more people are going to be exempt from paying income tax.
Right.
Seems like a good thing, putting more money in people's pockets.
It could be, but it really depends on how it's implemented and who ultimately benefits.
Right, who are the winners and losers?
Will this primarily benefit higher income earners? Or will it actually provide relief to those who are struggling to make ends meet?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah, it's all about analyzing those distributional effects.
Making sure things are fair.
Equity is key.
And there are other measures as well, right?
Yeah. Right. For instance, they're introducing a 5% contribution from civil servants' salaries towards their pensions.
So on the one hand, they're potentially getting a tax break, but on the other hand, they're now contributing to their pensions.
Yeah, it's a give and take.
It's about finding that balance.
And it highlights the need for that holistic perspective.
Right. We can't just look at these measures in isolation.
We've got to see the whole picture.
We need to consider the combined impact on individuals, households, and the overall economy.
It's all interconnected.
It's like a jigsaw puzzle. You can't just focus on one piece. You've got to see how they all fit together.
Exactly.
And speaking of fitting things together, let's not forget about debt management.
Right, that elephant in the room.
The Gambia, like a lot of developing countries, carries a significant debt burden.
It's a heavy load.
And that can really hold back the economy.
Yeah, it limits the government's ability to invest in essential services.
So what's the plan for managing this debt?
Well, they're talking about reprofiling short-term debt into longer-term obligations.
Okay, so basically stretching out the repayment period.
Right, easing that immediate pressure.
It's kind of like refinancing your mortgage to get a lower monthly payment.
Right.
But what are the trade-offs? Are we just kicking the can down the road?
Well, it could mean paying more in interest over the long run, so yeah, there's always that risk.
And of course, the risk of falling deeper into debt if things aren't managed carefully.
It's a delicate balancing act, for sure.
It really is.
And it really highlights the need for responsible borrowing, responsible spending practices.
Absolutely. Transparency is key.
And Gambians need to be aware of the risks associated with debt.
Right, and hold their leaders accountable.
For making wise financial decisions.
Because ultimately, it's their future that's at stake.
Yeah, the burden of debt can really weigh heavily on a nation.
It can limit the ability to invest in education, in healthcare, in infrastructure.
All the things that are crucial for a thriving society.
Absolutely.
And this brings us full circle back to that idea of being surrealists, not automatons.
Right, being engaged citizens.
Gambians can't just sit back and passively accept these policies.
They need to be active participants.
They need to engage, they need to ask questions, they need to demand transparency, and they need to push for solutions that prioritize the well-being of all citizens.
So let's talk action steps.
Okay.
What can our listeners do to make their voices heard?
Well, first and foremost, don't underestimate the power of simply being informed.
Okay.
You know, the budget documents are publicly available on the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs website.
Right.
You know, take some time to explore them, even if you just focus on the sections that are most relevant to your interests or community.
I know reading budget documents doesn't exactly sound like a thrilling way to spend an evening.
Right.
But trust me, once you start digging into the details, it can be eye-opening.
It really can be.
So it's not just about understanding the numbers.
Right.
It's about connecting those numbers to real-world impacts.
Exactly.
You know, think about how those budget allocations translate into programs and services and opportunities in your community.
Yeah, think about your daily life.
Right.
How is this going to affect you?
Right. So let's say you're passionate about youth unemployment.
Okay.
Dig into those workforce development programs, see how much funding they're getting,
Yeah, are they getting enough?
and ask yourself, is it enough to make a real difference?
And if you're concerned about, sustainable forestry practices,
Mm-hmm.
look at the budget allocations for those programs.
Right.
Compare them to other sectors. Are they getting the resources they need to protect, those vital ecosystems?
So knowledge is power, but what do we do with that power?
That's where engagement comes in.
Okay.
Share your insights with your community.
Uh-huh.
Talk to your friends and family about what you've learned.
Right.
Start conversations about these issues because awareness is the first step towards change.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to reach out to your elected officials.
Please do.
Let them know that you're paying attention.
Right?
You're asking questions, and you expect them to be accountable for how they're spending public funds.
Absolutely. They work for you.
Right.
Your voice matters, your vote matters, and your engagement can make a real difference.
The Gambia's 2025 national budget is a mixed bag.
It is.
There are some positive aspects, for sure. But there's also some glaring omissions and questionable priorities that really need to be addressed.
Absolutely. But, this is not the end of the story.
Right.
It's up to all of us as informed and engaged citizens to keep asking those tough questions.
Yeah.
Holding those in power accountable and working towards a future where the Gambia's budget truly reflects the needs and aspirations of all its people.
So the Gambia's 2025 national budget. Thank you for joining us on this journey.
Yes.
We hope you've learned something new, gained some valuable insights, and most importantly, feel empowered to make a difference.
And remember, knowledge is power, but only if we use it wisely. So stay informed, stay engaged,